Many of you have probably been told that stretching is one of the most important physical activities that you can do, and that stretching and mobility specifically are pillars of physical fitness that should be prioritized at all times. So today we're going to talk about why this is a myth, why it's not supported, why it's a bunch of baloney, and what you can do instead to achieve similar outcomes in terms of the goals that you might have with static stretching. So the first things first is, what are the claims that are generally made? Well, the first claim is that stretching, specifically static stretching, is good for improving flexibility. And what people generally mean by flexibility is mobility, meaning how much can they move their joints. And now, this is the one thing that I really can say is true about static stretching, which is that it does transiently improve range of motion. Although the question remains to be seen whether improving range of motion in a majority of populations is actually a good thing, because we don't have hard evidence to suggest that it is. And in some cases, actually, we have evidence to suggest that flexibility is not only not necessarily good, and that more is necessarily better, but that in some populations, more may actually be problematic, more in populations that actually have range of motion issues from the perspective of a neurological discrepancy between the brain's ability to perceive position and the actual safety of those positions. Those populations in particular actually have seen specific issues when it comes to improving range of motion. So if anything, the question of range of motion and mobility and whether or not it is good or bad for joint health is something that at the current moment is either unknown, meaning that we don't really understand that relationship, or that, again, in some instances has actually been proven and shown to be a net negative on things that we use to measure joint health and things like injury rate, for example. There have been studies that have shown that static stretching may actually improve or increase, rather, the rate of injury within a given population. And there has also been evidence to suggest that in certain sports-specific populations and scenarios, that static stretching may actually deter us from improving the output and the strength that we're able to demonstrate in certain tasks. So that's kind of what we know in relationship to these claims, although these claims tend to be made in a very absolute and generalized way that I think really just comes as a consequence of having been indoctrinated into a particular belief or a particular system early on in one's career. So I don't necessarily blame the average person for having this viewpoint, because it is something that is so widespread and believed in, but it's important that we actually ask these questions and that we ask them in a way that is more specific and context dependent, rather than just, again, making the claims as broad scopes absolute. So this is first things first, is like, let's just talk about the claims and sort of debunk them. Even without the context of research, you can kind of just talk about, like, logically, okay, why would more be better in what particular case? And usually people don't really have answers other than that, oh, it feels good. So that's maybe a good point to make, is that if you are someone who enjoys static stretching, you enjoy it as a part of your daily routine, maybe you like to do it when you wake up in the morning because you like the way that it makes you feel, and you yourself are comfortable and confident in doing that and applying those sort of tactics that people use to static stretch carefully to your body and respectfully, then that's not something that I see a problem with. I think if you enjoy the activity, much like if you enjoy any other activity, you should do that, and I'm not here to tell you to do, but I am here to debunk the belief that these things will improve these other metrics, when in fact we have no reason to believe that they do. And again, many of these questions haven't even been asked or measured long term. So those are the claims. What are the bits of truth that we can sort of extract from the current research? Well, static stretching, first of all, is really just isometric contraction. So what does that mean? Well, if you go to touch your toes and you wake up in the morning and you're super stiff and you try to touch your toes, you'll get down to a certain point. And what really takes you there oftentimes is a measure of contraction, right? If your muscles didn't contract at some point and stop you, then your joints would essentially just fall apart and you would melt into the floor like a pile of goop and pudding, right? So anytime that you are static stretching, right, again, touching your toes, people say, oh, I feel this big stretch in my hamstrings. It's like, what is that sensation? Well, it's your brain essentially calling upon a tissues to contract, to prevent you from moving further. So why is that signal something that should be considered bad? Why is tightness bad, right? Tightness is merely just a small sensation of discomfort that says, hey, don't go any further, right? And my opinion is that we should actually respect that boundary, and not that we should continue to just constantly try to push past it, again, for reasons that not only are unsupported, but again, we may have reason to believe the opposite of that in certain populations. So static stretching ultimately is just contraction, right? We don't need to approach it with this very mystical, magical sort of an aura. We can just simply put it as Static stretching is contraction. What happens with static stretching is your brain essentially gets used to a position, right? As in the case of the toe touch that I mentioned earlier. And what you all know if you static stretch is you can generally go further over time. And people commonly will label that as a sort of relaxation of the nervous system. However you want to put it, I'm not particularly competent enough to be able to explain the mechanisms behind that, but I will link resources in the description that you can look into more thoroughly to understand it. But essentially, you can think of static stretching as this thing that we essentially train as a skill. And as you all know, the more that you train a skill, the better that you get at the skill. And specifically within the window of becoming more mobile, people usually become transiently more mobile and more flexible. In other words, their tissues create amounts of tension that allow us to go farther and farther into the range of motion. But again, that doesn't necessarily imply good. That doesn't imply healthy. That doesn't imply any of those things, right? So, and that's really the point that I want you all to sort of take home from this. So what kinds of evidence do we have outside of this? Well, the first thing that I want to mention is and I'm going to link this in the description, there is this article, which is really a book on essentially all the research in relationship to static stretching. This guy, Paul Ingram of PainScience.com, breaks it down in a very, very thorough and digestible way, a very concise way. And although the article is very deep, he does provide a lot of different chapters and specific places that you can go to have specific questions that you have answered, right? So it's very detailed that way. But what I would say is the takeaway from this is that static stretching overall, in terms of, again, the research that we currently understand, really only does one thing, and it improves the static stretch that you're doing. We don't have, again, reason to believe that it reduces pain. We don't have reason to believe that it reduces injury. We don't have reason to believe that it overall will improve strength. We don't have a reason to believe any of that, and yet somehow the world has come to believe these things without a significant body of evidence, really just based on what I believe is people's just individual experience and personal experience. So again, I'll sort of harken back to what I mentioned earlier. If you enjoy static stretching and you find that you are able to, again, respect the boundaries of your body and sort of push carefully as you go through different, bouts of stretching, by all means, go ahead, do it. If you enjoy it, continue to do it just like you would, continue to enjoy lifting or yoga or running or whatever other physical activity. I'm never someone to discourage someone from being physically active. But where I will caution you is if you are someone who does have these beliefs currently that static stretching will improve all of these metrics that you think that it will improve, you should think again. And you should refer to this article and this body of evidence that doesn't suggest any of that, and that, again, in some instances suggests the opposite. So with stretching and with all modalities similar to stretching, foam rolling is another good one that falls under this category. We have a lot of questions yet to be answered, and we should just be very careful about telling other people what to do when we don't have good reason or good evidence to suggest that it is in fact what we should do and that it is in fact helpful. This doesn't mean that there is zero application. This doesn't mean that there will never be application, but it does mean that for now, this is the evidence that we have and that we shouldn't make claims that suggest or claim the alternative. If you like this video and you want to learn more from me, please consider enrolling in my online anatomy and biomechanics course. The course contains over 15 hours specifically dedicated to improving your understanding of anatomy and physics and how it applies to lifting weights. Over 3,000 students have enrolled in this course and have reported back that it's the most easy to digest material that doesn't include any sort of boring textbook lecture that you might normally find in a typical college curriculum. So if you want to improve your ability to lift and as a consequence grow muscle more easily and reduce your pain in the gym, check out the link in the description.